All right, so we're talking about Chapter 1, Social Policy, Social Programs, Analyzing the Social Problem, Background of Social Policies and Programs. All right, so this is just foundation for really what we're going to talk about in terms of social problem analysis. All right, so starting with and I'm going to push this away because I'm still not feeling great, and everything is a little heavy on the mic here. So the importance of a social problem, okay? We talk about three important things. One, the power and social status of those who are defining the problem. And as you can imagine, I mean, think about this. You probably can already start to guess why this is problematic to begin with. Okay? Because what if you don't have power? And what if you don't have social status? But you're the one who's supposed to be identifying the problem. And if you leave it up to others to define the problem, those who have power, social status, they may not get it. Right? So that's really important. And the importance of why our work involves that last type of work, the macro part. Because we have to speak. We have to use our collective power and status as professionals to speak for those who are experiencing and defining the problems and making sure that they're defined appropriately. Without it, things don't get where they need to be as far as a social problem and the policies and money that follows that. All right, so think about a few things. I go way back when HIV first was discovered in human beings. And because the people who are experiencing the problem and therefore initially defining the problem were mostly gay men and some IV drug users. People who had power and social status weren't giving any attention up to and including the President of the United States. Okay? And know that during that time period where this thing that originally was called GRID and then AIDS, and now we know it's the HIV virus, that period of time where there was silence, many, many, many people died, because those who had power and social status weren't defining the problem as a problem. Okay? Even today, when you think about it, we have plenty of things that are going on, not the least of which is climate change. And until people in power are willing to accept climate change and accept science, we're still going to continue to have devastating floods and fires and hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes and everything climate change seems to be leading to, including the lack of resources. All right? And as you can see, number two, sheer number of people affected. Okay, and again, you can look around and you can see people who are affected by many things. But if those people who are affected don't have power or social status, the sheer numbers alone may not be enough. It may start the conversation, and we may have to educate, which is what we've had to do over many years. Okay? I think back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, okay? The Industrial Revolution, when you had individuals and families who were migrating to the cities and living in slums. And as far as the power and the social status, they had none, okay? But those who did were completely ignorant and did not see, therefore could not define a problem. And that until it was brought to the attention and that there were people who had power and social status were willing to stand up, nothing was happening, right? So you can look at the numbers, but sometimes the numbers are not enough. And then when you look at the amount of destruction to society an unaddressed problem has on it, and so, well, turn around. Climate change, when you look at the fires, if it's not burning in Washington, D.C., okay, if Washington, D.C. is not flooding, if Washington, D.C. is not having earthquakes and hurricanes and that are destroying homes and landmarks and all sorts of things. Washington, D.C. doesn't have, forest and bush and everything that burn to the ground. All right? So until we see the destruction across the board and not just in pockets around the world, again, these things are not necessarily seen as serious social problems. Okay? All right, the nature of social problems. And your book kind of talks a little bit about how these are connected. All right? We have things that are social problems. We have, like losing a job is a personal problem. Okay? But losing a job can be a technological side effect that results from a business problem, and the business problem results from economic problems. So when we're looking at the nature of social problems, we have to look at, all four levels, and how they are interconnected, right? And how, like for example, technological side effects. Technology we've always thought was good. Industry we always thought is good, but look at the problems that happened as a result. All right. So, when we brought technology, for example, into business to resolve business problems, because business was having economic problems, so technology was able to do the work of 10 people, perhaps. And that was good for business. But the side effect of that was that ended up with people being laid off and losing their jobs. All right. So when we look at social problems, and as you'll see in part 2 of this, we'll look at these connections. We'll talk later about causal chains. All right. So social problems are, one, concerns about the quality of life for large groups of people. All right. So kind of coming back here again and looking at this idea of large groups of people. What about smaller groups of people? Okay. What about the quality of life for undocumented immigrants that are being held at detention centers and their children? But, will we be willing to look at that since it only affects one group, and we can, say things like, well, if they didn't come here illegally, they wouldn't have a problem. Yet the span of impact is growing and growing. People who are out of the country for even business or military. Now the threat is that their children won't be considered citizens. Okay? Women who are coming into the country legally but are pregnant may be denied. So as we just allowed, or at least the administration support allowed, we see it's now growing like a cancer. Okay? Social problems are concerns voiced by the socially powerful or the economically privileged, and that goes back to the nature. Okay? The voices of the socially powerful and the economically privileged. Well, if it doesn't affect them, will they voice? Will they identify something as a social problem? Will they be heard? Okay? And one of the things that we certainly see is that, depending upon where that power and privilege comes from, because we have people who have power and privilege for a lot of reasons, because they are famous, because they are actors or performers or athletes, and are trying to voice social issues and use their privilege, right? But whether or not that's enough to get the attention it needs to create change has been the question at this point on many issues. However, think about somebody like Kim Kardashian, who, quite frankly, I've never seen a Kardashian television show, not really wanting to, but she does seem to be using her voice to help the wrongfully incarcerated. She is using her social power and her privilege to actually accomplish something, which, as they say in Australia, good on her, good on ya. But whether that's enough to really change the problems. There are plenty of famous people who are talking about climate change and can't get through to those who are making the national and international policies. Okay? And social problems are problems that have grave implications for the continuing function of society. And, this is where we oftentimes disagree, and then nothing gets done, because there are those who see that climate change has grave implications. And there are others who have power, who have wealth, who are just like, you're overreacting, this is all liberal crap, and they don't see, they don't want to see. They're not ready to see until all of a sudden, their house is flooded. Okay? So this is oftentimes where we have issues when it comes to policy, establishing policy, and also reviewing policies that are inadequate. Okay? So social problem analysis. All right, there are 4 dimensions that we need to do when we're analyzing a social problem. We need to identify the way the problem is defined. We need to look at the cause and consequence of the problem. We need to be discussing the ideology that makes the events of concern come to be defined as problematic. And we need to look at who benefits and who suffers from the problem. And for me, number 4 is actually the scariest, okay? Because you often have situations where those who benefit, as long as they're not suffering, too often it's like, then we don't care, okay? And I can go back to something that happened, way back 30, 40 years ago, where there was a car, I think it was a Pinto, and if it got hit from behind, it exploded, okay, because of a manufacturer design. And what happened was Ford did an analysis and looked at what it would cost to pay out versus what it would cost to redesign and recall all the cars. And they decided that it would be cheaper to pay out. And so that's something that was, when it was pointed out those many years ago, people were horrified. But we have this today. We have this with people always making decisions, the benefit and cost, the benefits and sufferers, who's benefiting, who's suffering. So that is the scariest part of human nature in regarding to social problems and social problem analysis. All right, so problem definition, okay? Because as your book talks about in the very beginning, we can't look at social problem analysis as right or wrong, all right? We can't look at it as personal or not personal, right? We have to look at how things are being defined and specify terms that must be used, okay? So we know what we're talking about. So eligibility rules, for example, is one way that, how we have to specify something. Who is or who is not entitled to benefits, okay? Based on our definition of the problem. So if the definition of the problem is that, people who do not make enough income to eat properly, okay? So we have, people who are going hungry. All right. And so the definition of who we want to help is very important. Who's eligible for a service like SNAP, formerly known as food stamps? Who's eligible? Okay. Are people who are not working? Are we only talking about people who don't have jobs can get SNAP? Can people who have jobs but still can't afford to get food, can they get SNAP? To people who are receiving other benefits, other income like Social Security or SSI, can they get SNAP? Can they get food stamps? Okay. So, we have to kind of go back and look, what are we trying to do? Who are we trying to help? What problem are we trying to address? And so services, who's entitled to the service to specify the general goals to be achieved? Do we want to wipe out hunger for all? Okay. So problem definition is an important step. Okay. Therefore, they need to be specific, detailed, concrete, and measurable. All right, measurable. Okay. Definitions that are specific, concrete, or measurable are useful because then, first of all, everyone knows what we are referring to. Okay. When we talk about the poor, right now, we don't have an agreement where everybody knows what we're talking about. Because when people think poor, they think people who have no jobs. Okay? They don't think about the working poor. When they think poor, they think people who are poor through no fault of their own. Right? And so they're not thinking of people who are poor, because they are addicted to a substance. Our definition seems to separate that out. And blame comes back. Okay? What about people who are homeless? Right? Why are they homeless? Are they homeless because they just won't go to a shelter? Or are they homeless, because they live with domestic violence? Or are they homeless because they're mentally ill? All right? So we have to know specifically and precisely what we're all referring to in order to, establish effective programs and know who the programs are there to help. We also need to be specific, concrete, and measurable because we want to be able to construct estimates of incidents and then be able to discuss causation. All right? Because as you'll see shortly, causation is helpful when trying to, address a social problem. Okay. And then we come to the idea of causes and consequences. Okay. And this is where I may have, now gone into 2 and into 3. Okay. But I'm going to certainly put up all 3 of these videos, and hopefully you'll get the gist of this particular chapter from the videos. Okay. All right. So let me just